Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I have always handmade my felt eyes from scratch, and I always get so many questions asking how I do it, so I thought today I'd walk you through my entire process. I'll insert my credentials here on screen so that you guys know I mean business. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Here's what you'll need. A crocheted head, or I guess whatever limb you're gonna be crocheting eyes onto. I don't know, I don't judge. But in this case, we're sewing eyes onto a head, so we have the head already crocheted. You'll need scissors. I cannot recommend these Fiskars micro tip scissors enough. These are my favorite scissors in general, but they're also extremely helpful when you're cutting out felt. You'll need felt sheets in the colors of your choice. You can get these for like 50 cents from any craft store or like Walmart. As you can see, mine are a bit cut up because I've already used them a bit, but they're just the cheap standard rectangular shaped felt sheets. And I'll be using white and yellow for these eyes. You'll also need matching embroidery floss. This yellow floss matches my yellow felt, and this white floss matches my white felt. But you'll obviously want whatever colors match your felt. These don't necessarily need to be an exact match, just similar enough in color that the thread will blend in with the felt. And then you'll also need needles to sew with. A long embroidery needle is super helpful, but any embroidery needle will do. I also find that using a long yarn weaving needle is super helpful. You'll also want some sewing pins to pin your eyes in place. And you'll also want a device that allows you to take photos and edit them. I personally use my iPad, and an Apple Pen is a bonus because it makes the process so much easier. But it is absolutely not necessary. I used to just do this on my phone with my finger. And lastly, you'll just need some paper and then a pen or a pencil to draw with. Now that we've got all the materials, we can jump into how I design the eyes. Step one is to take a photo of your plushie's head with whatever device you have. Like I said previously, you can use an iPhone or an iPad, but you'll want to photograph the side of the head that you want the eyes on, so the front of the head. For example, I want the eyes right here and right here, so I'm going to take a photo of this side of the head. Once you have your photo of your head, we'll move on to step two, which is to sketch out the eyes. On your photo, click the edit button and then click the draw button, which is usually in the shape of a pen or pencil or marker or something. And from here, you can just sketch out the eyes. They don't have to be perfect at all, just a basic sketch of what you want them to look like. This is how my drawing turned out, and as you can tell, it's not perfect, and that is totally fine. It's just a rough idea to figure out what shape and size you want the eyes to be. Now we're gonna move on to step three, which is to use our drawing to answer the following questions. 1. How many rounds long is your drawing? 2. How many stitches wide is your drawing? 3. What rounds does my drawing land on? The answer to these questions will help you scale how large you want your eyes to be, as well as help you with placement. My eyes are about 7 rounds long, 7 stitches wide, and the top of the eye lands on round 13, and the bottom of the eye lands on round 19. It might also be important to note how many stitches apart your eyes are. Mine are 11 stitches apart. And if you're having trouble counting your stitches because it's literally underneath of your drawing you just made, just simply erase the drawing, count the stitches, and then undo that erase. That way your drawing isn't harmed and you can still count your stitches underneath of the drawing. If you need a real life visual reference, you can do what I did here and map out the perimeter with sewing pins. This top pin is between rounds 12 and 13 because the top of the eye lands on round 13. This bottom pin lands between rounds 19 and 20 because the bottom of the eye lands on round 19. And then I just kind of estimated the placement of these pins to be 7 stitches apart, and I used my photo as reference. Step 4 is to make a stencil of your eyes using paper and a pen or pencil. If there is any chance that you'll be remaking this project, you will be doing yourself a ginormous favor right now by creating this stencil, trust me. We'll be referencing step 3 and our drawing to draw out a stencil of our eyes. This is where if you made the visual reference with sewing pins, that it will come in handy. You can either use a measuring tape or just kind of use your fingers to guesstimate to put that same amount of space on paper. You can use the length between these sewing pins as a guide to create your stencil. So I'm actually kind of cheating for this eye design because they're just circles, so I'm using this spool as a guide to create the perfect circle shape. But you can just draw whatever shape you made in your digital drawing, just make sure it's scaled to the correct proportions we mapped out in step 3. I also like to draw the eye details onto this stencil so I can have an idea of what the eye will overall look like. Each detail or shape you made in your drawing is going to be a different layer of felt. So for my eyes, I have 2 smaller layers that I'll inevitably be cutting out, but I don't find the exact shape of these details as important, so I usually just freehand cut them out afterwards without a separate stencil. It's kind of hard to see here, but I'm just labeling my layers of felt to give you guys an idea of what I mean. When you finish drawing up your eye design, you can now cut it out with scissors. You can then place it onto the head of your plushie to see if it's an ideal shape and size. If it's not, you can redo this step until it's up to your standards. Now that we're happy with our stencil, we can use it to cut out the base layer of felt for our eyes. For me, the base layer is white, so I'm going to use my stencil to cut out a piece of white felt. And of course, I'm going to cut out 2 pieces since I'm making 2 eyes. As you can see here, I usually cut out my initial piece of felt very loosely, and then I go back in to be very precise and get a clean cut. I find that this is way easier than trying to cut out the perfect piece straight off the felt sheet. After we've used a stencil to cut out layer 1 of our eye is when the micro tip of these scissors really comes in handy. I use the micro tip to really refine the edges and try to cut off any fraying ends of the felt, and I also just try my best to make the cut as smooth as possible. After your base layers are cut, you can cut out any other layers of details. Again, I don't use a stencil for this part, I just freehand cut it out using my base layer as a reference. I have cut out stencils for all layers before, and I didn't find it to be too beneficial for me personally, so I opt out of it typically. To cut out the detail layers, I usually just cut out a shape slightly larger than the estimated size I want it to be, and then I shape it from there. The best tip I can give you for this part is that you can always make it smaller by cutting it, but you can't make it larger once it's cut. So make small cuts and changes until you get it to be the exact size and shape you want. I like to cut little by little and periodically reference my base layer to see how it looks and if the proportions are what I'm going for. If they're not, I keep cutting. As you can see, that's what I'm doing here. I'm slowly cutting the yellow piece of felt until it's the shape and size that I want it. You'll also see how I keep placing it back onto the white layer of the eye to reference what it would look like. This helps me figure out how big I want it to be and if I need to keep cutting. If I'm making a symmetrical piece, I like to fold the piece in half and cut whatever isn't symmetrical. This will help perfect your shape. When you cut out the first piece of a detail layer, use it as a stencil to cut out the second one so that they're identical on both eyes. This will ensure the pieces are exactly the same shape and size. Now you're just going to see a speed run of me following the same exact process as before, and you'll notice I end up with a near identical piece, which is exactly what we want. Now you'll see that I'm making my third layer, which is the reflection of the eye, or that little white oval piece. I follow the same exact technique that I used for the yellow layer. So I start by cutting out a piece larger than the estimated size of the oval that I want. Then I start cutting out the oval, but I make sure not to cut too much. From there, I focus on cutting little by little until I get the desired shape and size. And there we have it. We have one eye all cut out, so now I just have to make an identical piece to the one I just made. So once again, we'll just be using the first piece we cut out as a stencil. And from there, we'll follow the same exact steps as we have for all of the previous felt pieces. Since this eye I'm cutting out is super simple, I'll actually be using a previous stencil to show you guys how I cut out some of my more abstract layers. Ignore the previous drawn details, I've adjusted them since the drawing was made. But for layers like this, where it needs to be the same exact shape as the base layer except for one side, I usually use my base layer as a stencil for the most part. I'll cut out the base layer in the new layer's color and then cut it down on whichever side is different. That might be super confusing without a visual, but I swear it's not, so let me show you what I mean. So you can see here, I started by cutting out
out my white base layer using my stencil, which is the same thing I did for the previous eyes. Now I'm just cleaning up the edges of the eye with the micro tip of my scissors once again, and I'm also doing the technique where I fold my piece in half to make sure it's symmetrical.
The next layer of this eye is the black layer, which you can see an example of on the felt eye at the top. This layer will demonstrate what I meant when I said all that confusing stuff earlier. I'm starting off by using my white base layer as a stencil and cutting that out in black. Now I'm just quickly cleaning up the edges. Once that's done, I cut off a small portion of the felt on the right side so that the white of the base layer peeks through on the right. I'm doing this with the base layer attached so that I can easily reference how much I want to cut off, but obviously just make sure you don't also cut the white base layer. Now I am only showing myself making this one eye, but if I were to make the other eye, I would obviously cut off the left side instead of the right. So just keep that in mind as well. Now I'm going to cut out this little blue layer except in yellow. Since 3 of the sides will need to conform with the black layer that we just cut out, I'm going to use that layer as a stencil, kind of. Obviously it's a very small piece, so I just use the bottom of the black piece as a stencil instead of the entire thing. I start by cutting off a small rectangular piece and then use the black layer as a guide to make it the same shape. Now I'm left with a flat edge on the top and I want it to be curved. So at this point I'll just freehand the curve to my liking. Remember to cut small pieces so you don't accidentally cut too much. Another tip I have is that I rarely ever make pointy ends on my felt pieces. This may just be a personal preference, but I always at least slightly round out any pointy tips. I did this on this yellow layer, and even though it still looks pointy, I definitely trimmed those points up to be more round.
Now once again, I'm cutting out the little white reflection piece of the eye, and I start large and continue to cut small pieces off until it's the desired size.
You'll see I continue to reference how it would look on the eye to gauge the sizing. I know this is quite redundant because I showed this to you with the previous set of eyes, but I genuinely follow these same steps for all of my felt eyes that I design and make.
Now that we have our pieces cut out, we're going to sew the pieces onto each other layer by layer. I'm using an embroidery needle. Technically this is a beading needle, but I use that and of course matching embroidery floss. Since I'm going to start by sewing the yellow layer on, I'm going to use yellow embroidery floss. Embroidery floss like this usually has 6 strands, and when I'm embroidering felt eyes, I only use 1 strand. So as you can see here, I'm cutting off only 1 strand of embroidery floss. There's definitely easier ways to unwind it. I have no idea why I made it so difficult for myself in this clip. But yeah, make sure you only use 1 strand of embroidery floss. When you begin this process, you always want to start from the bottom to the top. Since I have 3 layers, I start by sewing the second layer onto the first. I always start by inserting my needle from the back, and I make sure to bring it out of the layer that I'm sewing on. This way I have better control to insert my needle at the very edge of the layer I'm sewing on. I like to insert my needle as close to the edge as possible so that the sewing isn't messy or super noticeable. Something else to mention is that when I sew all sides of the detail layer onto the base layer unless they're part of the outer edge of the eye. For example, for these circle eyes, I'll sew around the entire edge of the second layer because none of it is part of the outer edge of the eye. For the other eye, I'll only be sewing the right side down of the second layer because all other sides of that layer are part of the outside edge of the eye. And that outside edge is going to be sewn onto the head, so we don't want to double sew it, if that makes sense. It would just look way too messy if we did that.
You've made your last stitch. Now what? If your ends are close enough together like mine were, you can simply tie your ends in a knot on the back side of your eye once you've finished. If they're not close together, you can weave your working end over to your other end and then tie them together, which I can demonstrate a little bit later.
Next, I'll show you how I sew the second layer onto the other eye. To do this, I'll be using 1 layer of black embroidery floss and an embroidery needle. Again, this is technically a beading needle, but whatever. And like I said previously, I'll only be sewing the right side of the second layer because all of the other sides are part of the outside edge of the eye, which is going to be sewn down onto the plushie. I'm sewing exactly the same. The only difference is that I'm not sewing around the entire second layer like I did for the last eye. If your ends aren't close enough to tie off, like mine aren't here, you can weave your floss closer and tie your ends together that way. You literally just weave your needle in and out from the base layer over towards your other end of thread. And you can also feel free at this point to cut your ends shorter if necessary. Now let's move on to the third layer. For the circle eyes, we'll once again be sewing around the entire third layer because none of it reaches the outside edge of the eye. I'm doing the same exact thing that I did for layer 2, but I'm using one layer of white embroidery floss instead. Once I finish sewing the third layer on, I'll tie together my ends and trim them if necessary. At this point, this circle eye is complete because there were only 3 layers to sew together. Now let me show you how I sew on the third layer of the other eye. I'll only be sewing the top and right edge because the other sides are part of the outside edge of the eye. And of course, I'll be using one layer of yellow embroidery floss to match the yellow felt. Now if you only have 3 layers like my circle eyes did, then you're all done. But if you have a 4th layer like my other eye here has, then you'll want to sew that on next. This is just a white piece that doesn't connect to the outside edge of the eye, so I'll be sewing the entire layer down with one layer of white embroidery floss. Now do you notice how when I flip my felt eye to the back, you can kind of see the detail layers peeking over the edge? I tend to do this slightly on purpose so that when I sew the eyes onto the head, the base layer doesn't peek through. So another tip I have for you is to remember you'd rather have your detail layers hanging off of the edge of the eye rather than not close enough to the edge of the eye, because then your base layer would peek through and that's just not ideal. Now of course after one eye is done, you will want to do all of this sewing for the other eye as well, making sure to invert the design. Now that the layers are all sewn together, we can sew the eyes onto the head. We didn't sew the outside edges of the eyes because we're going to be using that to sew the eyes onto the head. This doesn't necessarily apply to this style of eye because none of the layers are touching the outside edge of the eye, but that's why I showed you a different style of eye as well. If we had sewed all of the layers together at the outside edge, it would be very messy looking in the end. So overall, it's just important to make sure the outside edge of the eye has no embroidery prior to this step. But to start this step, pin your eyes exactly where you want them to be using sewing pins. And remember, you can refer to your original digital drawing as well as the answer to our questions in step 3 to get an idea of placement.
Since I'm sewing the circle eyes onto this face for this tutorial, I will only need one layer of white embroidery floss because the entire outside edge of the eye is white. But if I were to be sewing an eye like this other one I made, I would need one layer of white to sew the white felt onto the head, one layer of yellow to sew the yellow felt onto the head, and one layer of black thread to sew the black felt onto the head. So basically, you'll want to color coordinate the thread with the color of felt you're sewing onto the head. To start sewing, remember I recommended not only an embroidery / beading needle, but a weaving needle as well. Embroidery needles are so thin and flimsy that it's difficult to bring them out of a specific stitch. My solution to this is using a long weaving needle to feed the embroidery needle through any stitch of the head. I only really do this in certain circumstances, like when I'm bringing my needle in or out of the head at a random spot and not near the felt eyes, or if I'm having a hard time getting the embroidery needle to come out of a specific stitch. If I don't do this, sometimes my embroidery needle will catch onto stitches that I don't want them to and tug on random spots of the plushie's head, creating an indent or a dimple-like appearance when it's tugged on. I like to avoid this for obvious reasons. This is just a tip and not necessary, but it's been a game changer for me. The weaving needle has the perfect divot for the embroidery needle to fit into, so you kind of just place the tip of the embroidery needle into that divot and use that to guide your embroidery needle through the plushie's head. As you just saw, I start sewing by inserting my needle anywhere into the head and then bringing the needle out of the head at a stitch that's right next to the eye. Wherever you want to start
start is totally up to you. It doesn't really matter. But then insert your needle into the eye fairly close to the edge of it, and also make sure to insert it into the plushie itself, bringing it out at the next stitch next to the eye. You may need to press down a little bit on the head to get your embroidery needle to come out where you want it to. And you want to make sure you're always inserting your needle into the felt and bringing it out of the head. This is how you'll get clean looking stitches. Where you bring your needle out of the head is much less important than where you insert your needle into the felt eyes. If when you go to insert your needle into the eye, your thread is pulling on the felt eye like you see here, the stitch you're bringing your yarn out of is too close to the eye. You don't want the felt eye to be pulled inwards, as it will overall make your eye look wonky if you keep doing this. Trust me, this will completely distort the shape of your eye as well as the placement. To fix this, just bring your needle out of a stitch that's further away from the eye. You'd rather have it too far away from your eye than too close, because the thread is so thin that when you pull it through, it will barely be seen. In this spot next to the face shaping, it was a bit too hard to bring my embroidery needle out of the correct stitch, so I brought my needle out of the felt and didn't insert it back into the plushie. Instead, I used my weaving needle trick. I used my weaving needle to feed my embroidery needle through the head and out of a random stitch. I then used it again to feed my embroidery needle through the correct stitch. This made it so much easier, as the weaving needle is much thicker and sturdier, whereas the embroidery needle is so thin that it will just bend with slight force. Once you sew around the entire eye, you can just bring both ends of your thread out of the same stitch and tie a knot. One of my threads is usually weaved into a stitch on the inner side of the head on accident, but if you think the thread is going to just come loose, make sure to weave it through a stitch, preferably on the inner side of the head, and then tie your knot. Hopefully that makes sense. Basically just secure your tails in a way that your threading won't come loose. And obviously after you secure your tails, you'll want to just tuck them into the head like I'm doing here. You can literally do this however you prefer. I just like to use my weaving needle to kind of stab it in there. Of course, you'll want to do this for the other eye as well, and there you go. Your felt eyes are sewn onto your plushie's head.
Alright, here's what he looks like with his eyes all sewn on. I know, he looks really crazy, but he does need his eyelids still. I'm sure by the time I edit and post this video, he will be all finished, so I will insert a picture right here of what he looks like done, because I cannot just leave you hanging looking at this thing. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. I hope this taught you a thing or two about designing and sewing on your own felt eyes. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for future tips and tutorials, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!